Okay, yeah, that number has reached the arbitrary threshold that I have set for myself to get started in. Actually, you may or may not want to hear this, actually, Oliver, but this has been our most subscribed to event. So I think that number to go
Yeah,
up quite
definitely
significantly and
want
to
to
get
hear
lots
that.
of people.
Definitely want to hear that, and I will be repeating that back to the other Metro mayors just for the record.
It's true. It's completely true. Anyway, hello everyone. Welcome to Meetings with Mayors. My name is Simon Kay. I'm the policy director at the think tank Restate. Meetings with Mayors is our special series where we have an in-depth conversation, and our ambition to have an in-depth conversation with each and every one of England's directly elected regional mayors. So 2 weeks ago, I was in conversation with Andy Burnham at a rather interesting moment to be doing that. In a few weeks' time, I'm going to be talking to Helen Godwin. And this week, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Oliver Coppard, who's the mayor of South Yorkshire. And now, look, nobody's tuning into this to hear from me. But before we get to the main event, and if you'll bear with me a little bit, Oliver, anyone not familiar with our work would like to know that Restate is an independent, charitable, cross party think tank focused on public service reform and improving government. So my job is to lead on the what we call the reimagining. There it is on the logo there, reimagining the local state program, which is all about questioning the unquestioned assumptions about devolution policy, local government policy, and the ways in which central government must also change to shift in my book, extraordinary over centralization of our country. Meetings with mayors is a big part of the program for us. It's our exploration of this brand new ingredient in English politics and policy. There's never been anything quite like it before in the way that we do things in this country. Mayors are directly elected, they are place based, they are sometimes highly disruptive figures in the way that things get done. I don't know if that's a word you welcome, Oliver. People who are often in a position to operate in ways that take them quite far away from the line of the national politics of the parties to which they belong. Now, the government today is setting a lot of store by the potential of new strategic authorities all over England and the mayors who lead them. So I think it behooves us to try to understand those mayors a lot better. And so, with that in mind, let me start by saying, Oliver Coppard, welcome to Meetings with Mayors.
Hi, let's see.
Thank you so much for joining us. Now, I start and end these in the same sort of way each time, and we're going to leave some time for questions at the end. People who have tuned in get the privilege of asking some questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. But the opening question is always the same. Oliver, what made you want to become a mayor, and what made you want to be the mayor of South Yorkshire specifically?
Just a series of bad life choices, I think. No, seriously, I think I I feel really lucky. Actually, I should probably start with saying to be in this job, particularly at this moment in time. I had 2 years or so with a Conservative government when, as the Labour mayor of South Yorkshire, I got next to no hearing, really, if I'm perfectly honest. But now with a Labour government, actually, it does feel very different. It's sort of chalk and cheese experience, actually. And so to be a mayor now with a government that are investing in mayors, I think genuinely trying to reshape the way in which decisions are taken, albeit not always successfully, but certainly the intention seems to be there centrally. It feels like a very good time to be a mayor. I always say it's the best job in politics, really, to be a mayor at this moment in time. But what made me want to be a mayor was simply the ability, the opportunity to help the place that I grew up, that I call home, that I want to call my home for the long term future. Like South Yorkshire is where I was born and raised, and the place I want to make better. And there's no greater way to do that, in my view, in British politics at this moment in time than by being a mayor. So it seemed like a huge opportunity, one too good to turn down. And I had my challenges with the Labour Party as a Jewish person under Jeremy Corbyn, but when I then had the opportunity to stand with Keir Starmer as leader, I grabbed that opportunity with both hands, and here we are.
South Yorkshire's a brilliant place. We love visiting there. We were up there a year ago to do our annual conference, where we spoke then as well. A bit more on that in a moment. It's a great place. It's the jurisdiction of South Yorkshire that you sort of preside over, that you are the mayor of. It's a very diverse place as well. Politically diverse. I think socioeconomically pretty diverse. lots of pretty affluent places, but quite a few places that are pretty deprived as well. And there's also sort of a town and country split. There's quite a lot of town, and there's a fair old amount of countryside as well. And the interests of the people in those different groups and in those different parts of South Yorkshire, they can be quite different to each other. But you're the mayor of the whole lot. So how difficult has it been to serve those interests all at the same time?
Yeah, so for those that don't know South Yorkshire as well as I do, or clearly Simon, you do, it's 1.4 million people, four places, two towns, two cities, Barnsley, Rotherham, Doncaster and Sheffield, right in the middle of the country, a place that was once defined by heavy industry, steel and coal in particular, and then went through a huge amount of economic and industrial turmoil in the 1980s. No shortage of challenges, either at that time or since, be it the decline of the steel industry, the coal industry, Battle of Orgreave, Hillsborough, obviously, clearly issues with CSE in Rotherham that we don't shy away from, and a bunch of other things besides. So no shortage of challenges, and then the economic scarring that's resulted from a lot of that is still plaguing our society in South Yorkshire today. So there are different challenges in different parts of the region, and there is a huge amount of inequality. So famously in South Yorkshire, the 83 bus route, which actually doesn't run the same route as it used to when the research was done, but the 83 bus route, which I grew up at one end of that bus route, the life expectancy between one end and the other end of that bus route, famously when they did the research, was 13 years. Now, I grew up in a wealthy bit of South Yorkshire, place called Worlow. That's where I spent my teenage years, at least. And that bit of South Yorkshire is wealthy, well-educated, one of the wealthiest and well-educated places in the whole of the country. The other end of that bus route, though, is huge poverty, and that is the story right across South Yorkshire. As you say, though, there is also the challenge of urban versus rural. Steve Houghton, the leader of Barnsley, that some people will know, always says that one of the challenges of South Yorkshire is the amount of grass. And what he means is just the amount of space between places. Because if you're trying to run a public transport system, where density is key to making it profitable, you actually need to be able to pick people up along the whole of the bus route. And we can't do that in lots of places in South Yorkshire because of the huge amount of rural space. So we're dealing with a load of challenges right across the region. And in some places they're different to in others. But I do think at root, everybody in South Yorkshire essentially wants the same thing. And I can't speak for the rest of the country, but I imagine it's not too dissimilar everywhere else. We all want to be slightly better off. I imagine we all want to be able to be proud of the place where we live, have pride in our communities, and we need purpose and we need agency. And I talk about this a lot, but I think one of the things that we're facing at this juncture is a crisis of agency. And in South Yorkshire, maybe more than other places, because of where we've come from and what we once had, and the decline of industry, the decline and fracturing of our communities that perhaps resulted from the decline of industry, the way in which we no longer have strong trade unions, employers, local councils that actually can act on behalf of our communities, and the way in which the community cohesion that we once had in spades in South Yorkshire, for good and bad, has now gone. That agency is no longer there. And so I think devolution is a hugely important part of how we restore agency back to communities, give people back hope and trust in politics, allow people to see that the things they want can be delivered by somebody in their community who has their best interests at heart. And that goes the same for Worlow as it does for places in other parts of South Yorkshire that don't have quite as much wealth, capital or agency as those wealthier bits.
Yeah, I think that you're right. There's a version of that sort of empowerment part of what we're doing with devolution that works for everyone. But I suppose the model of devolution that we're rolling out now across the country is inspired by, to some extent, templated on quite an urban centric one, isn't it? The one that was developed mostly for Greater Manchester and West Midlands. In the day to day operation of your role, when you're trying to get things done as mayor and you're trying to serve all those different interests, do you ever look at that arrangement, the way that your mayoralty works, your combined authority works, and think, this isn't quite equipped for a place like mine. It should be a bit different for my place.
I don't think any mayor, I mean, David Scaife included, who is probably the best, I think, proponent of a more rurally focused devolution model. He talks about this a lot, so I don't want to sort of steal his thunder, but I don't think any of us would say we've got the ideal model either for rural or indeed actually for urban environments. I mean, I think I would, there's loads of things I would change about the way in which devolution, I'm sure we'll get on some of them, which devolution should be done in this country. What is devolved to mayors, how much is devolved to mayors, even where the the area is notionally our responsibility. What is devolved, as well as how it is devolved, is still, I think, up for grabs. So there's all sorts of things that I would change, but equally, I think it comes down to, and I think all mayors feel this a bit. What do we choose to focus on, and how do we choose to address problems, and how do we choose to spotlight or highlight problems that we want to fix? So it is entirely incumbent upon me to say, actually, look, we've got a rural community here, potentially, for argument's sake, a farming community in South Yorkshire, which we do in spades, and I want to support that farming community potentially through, for instance, our local nature recovery strategy or a bunch of other ways besides. I think what we're all grappling with is what's the best way to grow an economy, though, and that's the fundamental question. And that leads you down traditionally in the economic model that we have down to a version of agglomeration, doesn't it? Density being key, therefore focus on cities and towns to a certain extent rather than rural environments, and then kind of building on that agglomeration and that density of population to grow an economy because of the spillover effects. And so actually it's not about whether or not the devolution model is right, it's whether or not we agree with or adhere to the idea of agglomeration causing economic growth. And I think that's the fundamental question, rather than just, is it urban versus rural?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think, look, if there are any economists listening later or tuned in now, they'll be nodding along. I guess that means that you need to make the case to people in rural areas that, yeah, we're going to probably do a bit of investment actually in the urban centres of this place, because that's how you're going to get the economy ticking over and make things possible down the line. That's a hard thing to advocate for, isn't it?
I probably make the case slightly differently. I think I say I want to go where the problems and the opportunities are, and I'll be agnostic in that. Frankly, if the biggest opportunity happens to be in, I don't know, Bark Green in Barnsley or Askin in Doncaster, then that's where we will go, and we will invest there and either solve that problem or grasp that opportunity. And there are opportunities everywhere in South Yorkshire. I mean, I think we are absolutely rightly focusing on certain core areas, be it Gateway East in Doncaster, where the airport is, be it Junction 36 in Barnsley, where there's a huge growth of logistics and to a certain extent digital sector growing there as well, or in Sheffield between Rotherham and Sheffield City Centre, where our innovation spine, Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, Olympic Legacy Park, the University Spine in Sheffield. So there's all sorts of things that we are investing in, and they do tend to be in places that are already growing, but we'll go wherever we need to in order to grow the economy, to give people opportunity. But I think that's why there's a couple of things that are attached to that. One, it's about being, I think, place agnostic. It is absolutely about saying, following the data and the insights that we have and making sure that we're doing the right thing for everybody by growing the economy for all of South Yorkshire. It's about saying, actually, everybody needs to be able to access the opportunities wherever they may be. So yes, we might put an investment into Barnsley, as long as people can access that through better public transport, better transport more broadly, potentially digital solutions, then frankly, that should also, it's not a million miles away from being something that you can get to. I used to work in Barnsley and live in Sheffield. It took me 28 minutes to get to work. And when I lived in London, despite the fact I lived in London and worked in London, it took me an hour and 15 minutes. So, I think there's always that sense of, can you access this opportunity, and what's our role in that? And then thirdly, I'd also say, look, sometimes this is about more than just, are we growing the economy? Do people feel better off financially? It's also about pride, and it's about purpose. So my strapline when I ran for election in 2022, first off, was restoring the pride and the purpose and the prosperity of South Yorkshire. And for me, those three things are a Venn diagram that overlap hugely. And actually, I think we need to think more than just about prosperity, but also think about purpose. What are we for? Everybody needs purpose, I think. And also, are we proud of ourselves? Are we proud of the place we're building? Do we have pride in place? And I think all of those things are just as important as saying, right, let's crowd all the money into a small, densely populated place and grow the economy in that fashion.
So I think that's a compelling answer. And the reason why I'm being a bit annoying about this whole trade-off sort of question, you don't have to agree. That's just me self-critiquing, Oliver. I do it a lot in these. But the reason why I'm sort of dog with a bone about it is because of something you said the last time we spoke. So, like I said, a year ago, brilliant event in Sheffield. We were joined by Kate Josephs, had a really great conversation, and I thought it was fascinating. People watching or listening can go find this online, but I'm going to do that thing where I quote you back at yourself.
Oh, no, here we go.
Here we go. So, well, this is something that stuck with me ever since you said it. You said that devolution isn't going to mature until mayors start taking really tough decisions. And then you said, and sometimes they need to be prepared to be unpopular. I'm very slightly paraphrasing, but that's
No, that's
more or less
right, and
verbatim
that's
what
my
he said.
take. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
That's what, yeah, yeah. So and it felt like a conviction statement when you said it. So mayors need to be willing to be unpopular, and I think that's fascinating because it cuts against a bit of a narrative. I think you tell me if you detected this as well. A bit of a narrative that surrounds the mayoral model that says, well, isn't the challenge that all of these guys, well intentioned or not, they're going to run to be mayor, and when they're in that position, they're strongly incentivized to go for popularity, to want to get as much support as possible, to go for re-election, and that means they're not going to make tough decisions about trade-offs. They're going to go lowest common denominator, and there's a whole bunch of stuff they'll never touch and never ask to touch or get the powers to touch because it's third rail stuff. It'll make them too unpopular if they do mess around with it. But you see the role quite differently, don't you?
Yeah, I think I do. Look, I'm in the fortunate position that when I got re-elected last time, I got re-elected with over 50% of the vote. I think I'm right in saying Tracy and David love it when I say this, the most popular mayor in Yorkshire. When you look at vote share, so I was really lucky. I'm a Labour mayor in South Yorkshire, but right now that doesn't feel like a very strong statement, does it? Given the surge of reform in the polls, at least we've got Doncaster Council, not the mayoral, but the Doncaster Council bit of the system controlled by reform. We're facing challenges in Barnsley, certainly, and elsewhere when it comes to reform. So look, there are challenges now to mayors like me who are Labour and previously might have thought that we would be able to take tough decisions and the political impact might not be as great as otherwise in other places. Now, Richard Parker's got a very different challenge with a small majority in the way that he does. But I think kind of to a certain extent, this is where politics has gone so wrong. Like we've just got to kind of ignore the electoral impact for a bit and worry a bit more about what's our impact on our communities. And I do think that it's expressed in different ways by different mayors, but I think we're all trying to say sort of the same thing, which is what's the thing that this place needs? What's the thing that this place wants? And sometimes that can sound a bit like populism because it's you trying to reflect back to the wider world what your community wants from your mayoralty or from devolution. And sometimes that can be set against the government or some other actor. So I would potentially, challenge the water companies or challenge the government when they say we are or aren't going to do this thing for South Yorkshire. And I kick back and say, well, actually, we don't want that. And it can sound like populism. But what sometimes that simply is me trying to stand up for my community. And I hope I do that both when it is popular, but also sometimes when it's not always as popular. So to give you an example, I think the clean air zone that was introduced in Sheffield, and actually a wider region than just Sheffield, it extends into Rotherham, although not a paid clean air zone. As you can imagine, before it was introduced, as we have seen elsewhere, not hugely popular. People don't like paying to be able to drive into certain parts of cities. It was a relatively limited clean air zone in that it was only on commercial vehicles, that were a certain age or below, and therefore kind of it was relatively mitigated. But I wanted to be out front of that debate, despite the fact it wasn't my responsibility to introduce it, because I think it's really important for health inequalities. So, when I was asked about that on the Today programme or whatever, my first answer is always, it's harming kids. Poor air quality is harming kids, and if this were water quality killing 1 in 20 children or 1 in 20 people in South Yorkshire, there would be a national outcry. But dirty air killing 1 in 20 people, as it does, is not mentioned in the same way or talked about in the same way. I don't think that's okay. And I'm all right being out front of that debate because it's the right thing for South Yorkshire. And if it has an electoral consequence, so be it. So I'm really kind of keen to kind of say to people, I will not always just be unchallenging of my own community. Like I don't think I can be or should be without kind of a challenge back to the communities of South Yorkshire. But I will also do that on the other side of the ledger too, and challenge the government or anybody else when they're not doing the right thing for this community either.
I think that's a fascinating example because it'll have become the kind of thing that will become more difficult now that the other kind of diversity you just raised is a bigger factor in the board that you manage as part of the combined authorities. As you said, we now have a lot of political diversity in the constituent authorities within South Yorkshire. Can you give us a sort of a sense check of how that's going and how those relationships are working? Are they working as you try to get things done?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the mayors, myself included, try and avoid getting into political dogfights on a regular basis. I mean, even when we had a Tory government, and I think your previous question was was probably more opposite when I had a Tory government. I was kind of more in the space of playing politics on easy mode, if I'm honest, because to a certain extent, you don't get something from the government. Well, you decry the government. When you do get something from the government, you say, look at the genius that brought this thing from the government, right? So it was kind of when you had a Tory government and a Labour mayor, it's sort of that's the way you can play it. Now, obviously, got a Labour government, don't get something. It's a bit harder to kind of defend that. When you do get something, you've kind of got to share a bit of the credit. So it's obviously a harder situation. So in that sense, certainly kind of devolution in South Yorkshire at least is kind of more mature. But equally, when we have different people represented, if not on the board of the MCA, then certainly in the constituent authorities of the boards of the MCA, the local authorities of the MCA, then that does make it more challenging. Frankly, so far, my line has held and will continue to hold as far as I can make it, which is, say, place over politics. So I will not try to get involved in dogfights unnecessarily. I always go to my scrutiny board. I'm always more than prepared to go and speak to opposition members or opposition councillors, because I think it's really important that, this is about me representing the whole of South Yorkshire. Yes, I have to get re-elected as a Labour mayor, but I am the mayor for all of South Yorkshire for as long as I am the mayor. And that requires me, if people have voted for a reform council as they have in Doncaster, to listen to the people who have been elected, absolutely and rightly, and elsewhere that'll be the case as well. And actually so far that has largely held, and that perspective of mayors is, I think, slightly different, partly because we don't have a direct opposition that we are running against on a day-by-day basis, but partly just because of the way in which we have all approached that role, and the way that we can take that place over politics approach is, I think, unique at this point in time in British politics, as far as I can tell.
And I suppose the other arena, that's not quite the right word, the other kind of area where that place over politics approach might get challenged more now is in the shifting culture of mayors as a category, right? So, I mean, the last time we spoke a year ago, with the single remaining holdout, that was Ben Houchen, all of the mayors were from the Labour Party, and we had a new government busily setting up a council of regions and mayors, and around that table, all the faces apart from Ben Houchen's were Labour supporting Labour Party faces. Very different picture now for obvious reasons. How's that made you change your view or evolve your view about the kind of the network potential of the mayoral model, the way that mayors need to work together, and the way that you can have a conversation with central government?
Not really, if I'm honest. Like, I think, give you an example. So we tried to work with Luke Campbell on the White Rose Agreement. So David, Tracy and I, before Luke arrived, were signed up to the White Rose Partnership, which is essentially a Yorkshire devolution partnership that we led in South Yorkshire. And David and Tracy good enough to sign up to that, looking at things like crime, safety, things like transport, obviously culture, and net zero. And we've done some work on rail with David Blunkett, who chaired that White Rose Rail partnership for us. And we tried to bring Luke into that. Luke, in the end, felt like he couldn't sign it because of the net zero commitments in there. That's his responsibility to kind of take that choice, and that's absolutely right for him if he's elected on that basis. Absolutely reasonable. But that doesn't become anything other than just an opportunity, and he can either take that or otherwise. We're not going to castigate Luke. We're not going to have a go at Luke. It's up to him to decide on behalf of his community what he wants to do. He's been elected by Hull and East Yorkshire. He should make decisions that reflect his electorate and what he was elected to do, and we'll carry on and do what we can. And it's for each of us to make those individual decisions as we move forward. But I don't think we end up in a fight with other mayors wherever we can help it, because why would we? What's the point? I don't see any benefit, frankly, for me or for South Yorkshire, and all the things I need to get done comes from me picking a fight with Luke Campbell in Hull and East Yorkshire, physically, certainly, given that he was an Olympic boxer, but certainly figuratively as well. Like, it doesn't do us any good. So what's the point? So we'll carry on working as a group where we can. And there are different forms of partnership across the mayors. I think Andy's now working with Paul Bristow in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, building on the relationship he had with Nick previously, looking at kind of how research spin-outs can maybe work in Manchester. And that's a great example, I think, where cross-party is still working. I can't see that should change, because on a geographic footprint, I'm not in competition with Luke Campbell or Paul Bristow or Ben Houchen. So why would we try and pick fights with them and not work with them? And if we can work with them, we will.
That's yeah, definitely not picking a fight with certain of your fellow mayors seems like a good move. Not casting no aspersions, but yeah, there's a qualitative difference if someone's been an Olympic boxer. You raised the pan regional forum. Do you see a growing role for that, even if some of your fellow mayors don't find themselves in a position where they can kind of commit to doing that? And does it tell us something about the real borders of the economies and the public services that you need to manage and improve on? I mean, getting transport right, that's really a whole Yorkshire affair, isn't it? Getting the economy right, you need to figure out where the specializations are across the
Yeah,
whole of Yorkshire. Is that fair?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, there's some obvious examples, like, for instance, I don't know, you've got Production Park in Wakefield, right? One big sort of production site of film, TV, theatre, music, etc. All based there. World class infrastructure in terms of culture out there, but it's what, 15 minutes from Barnsley. So why would I try and do anything other than just access that opportunity for children, young people, people who work in that sector? Why would I not try and work with Tracy to make sure they could access that opportunity rather than trying to compete? The same goes for kind of the other side. Claire Ward and I working with Andy Burnham on the peak partnership around transport. The Snake Pass is the core road really between Sheffield and Manchester, certainly the most direct route between Sheffield and Manchester. And anyone that's travelled on that road recently, as I have, will know that it's falling down. But it goes through Clare's mayoral combined authority. It's a road that's managed by Derbyshire County Council. I can't fix that without working with Clare and with Derbyshire. Andy and I can't grow our economies and the connection between them without solving that problem. So it has to be how do we solve the problems rather than what are those distinct lines on a map, which nobody really respects when it comes to how they live their lives. So why would we not try and soften those lines in the way that we are through working together on certain projects or on certain ideas? And sometimes that'll mean I have to support Tracy or Claire or Andy or anybody else, and sometimes they have to support me, and sometimes it means we have to support each other to get what we want from the government. But whatever that looks like, it has to be about the function of what we're trying to achieve. It has to be about the end goal rather than about whether or not there is a certain line on a map past which we cannot step.
I think that what you're saying about lines on the map, I think, rings true. Ultimately, those lines are always basically arbitrary, aren't they? Someone somewhere, perhaps someone in Whitehall, has decided to draw those lines at some point, and then they've been inherited by the new organisations, defined by who's in and who's out when the deal gets made, or whatever it is. I think that also goes to identity, doesn't it? Those lines don't necessarily have a bearing on identity. And I don't, well, maybe you're going to correct me on this, but is there anyone that you've met so far in your role who says, oh, yes, first and foremost, I am a South Yorkshirean? I think people might say, I'm a Sheffield. But, I mean, of course, yeah, when you look in the mirror, of course. But anyone else, I don't know.
So we've done some research on this with, I'm afraid, Labour Together. So we looked at some of the identity questions.
We love them.
I'm fascinated by this question because one of my and it goes back to one of your earlier questions about rural versus urban, about where do you put investment. I think one of the challenges we all face, and certainly we need to overcome in South Yorkshire, maybe more so than other places where, for instance, you've got Greater Manchester, where you've got the core city in the middle, which everybody I think accepts is the core city, and then you've got the other local authorities around it, and they bleed into each other a bit more than they do maybe here. Here we've got four distinct nodes, Barnsley, Rotherham, Doncaster and Sheffield, in South Yorkshire. So you don't even have the name of the core city in the title of the place, and a lot more I think, friction when it comes to identity. I don't think anyone from Barnsley would ever want to claim that they are from Sheffield, right? So you've got to be, I think, cognizant of that. But at the same time, when we looked at that, actually people are really proud of the idea that they're from Yorkshire. They're very proud of being northern. They're perhaps less proud of being from a specific place. They're certainly not as proud of being British, actually. So actually there are different identities at play. And I always think of it like a football team. I'm an Arsenal fan. Obviously, being from South Yorkshire, who else would I support, right? But I'm an Arsenal fan. And when I go to an Arsenal game, I'm more than happy to, not to my credit, but I'm always more than happy to, shout abuse at the Spurs fans. But when I go to an England game, then I'll stand alongside a Spurs fan and shout at the Germans, right? So actually, we've all got different identities that we attach to at different times in our lives. But what I think we need to do in South Yorkshire is elevate that South Yorkshire identity, so that when I say we're putting an investment into Doncaster, people in Barnsley can recognise that that's an investment that will benefit them, and vice versa, the same in Sheffield and Rotherham or whatever it might be. So I think we have to kind of acknowledge that identity plays a role, because otherwise, how do you get people to accept that the investment is for them? And we have to actively, I think proactively, I think go out and curate that identity and help people to understand that that identity relates to them. And that is important in the economic growth sense and in terms of the sense of trying to achieve our wider objectives. Because until and unless people can understand that, then I think that we are going to struggle to put investment into specific places without running up time and again against those challenges. I think, for what it's worth, I think I've got a harder challenge than maybe Greater Manchester, but I've certainly got an easier challenge than, for instance, Clare Ward. Right. So I think there are certain places where that is more obvious and certain places where it's less obvious. And, I could talk for days about the 3 ridings of Yorkshire and the fact that South Yorkshire was created in 1974, and like, how do we kind of understand South Yorkshire? The fact that it was previously Sheffield City Region, which was an economic geography, but not a political identity. And, there's all sorts of really interesting layers to that. But at its root, I genuinely believe that mayors, when we have combined authority areas, one of our challenges is to actively coalesce an identity around those geographies, because I think unless and until we do that, we're always going to come up against this challenge of where do we put the investment and how do people feel about that place and attaching an importance to it.
And I think one of the side effects of the work you're describing there, of taking on that question of identity, of helping people to understand that this is something that's important to their lives, I think maybe that's the kind of work that might be entailed in addressing one of the other, I think, sort of slightly mysterious aspects of this system, which is that directly elected figures like yourself carry considerable personal mandates and considerable levers of power, increasing levers as devolution continues, but they don't seem to be able to get people out to the polls on election day. And I don't think, and it's not a personal aspersion, it's the whole system. Local government elections are really low turnout. Mayoral elections are sort of stubbornly low turnout. In fact, they were slightly lower last time than they were the time before. And I'm still casting around for an explanation or a narrative that explains that phenomenon. But I wonder if part of the picture is this identity piece, this ownership piece that you're touching on there. Is there another aspect or other aspects to that that you're pondering about? And just to add a tiny bit of context, the last time we spoke a year ago, you said that you would consider it one of the kind of the temperature checks on success for your mayoralty, that turnout would go up as over the course of your time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I wouldn't want to put a kind of bet on how much it should or could go up by, but I certainly think over time we would hope to see a greater turnout at mayoral elections than we have seen. I have a bit of a bee in my bonnet about the idea of sort of rationality in politics. I think people sometimes try and draw a direct line between, are these jobs important and therefore are people turning out to vote for them, right? Because that's the sort of rational thought process that follows, right? Like, these jobs are important. The more important they are, the more people should turn out to vote for them. That seems like a rational thought process. I think we kind of think a little bit like that as politicians sometimes about things like communication. We've done a good job. We tell people we've done a good job. They should therefore vote for us, right? And as we all, I think, know, that isn't always the way that it works. So yes, absolutely, I would like people to see that I am doing more and better for South Yorkshire and therefore vote for me on that basis. But I also think there's a separate point to that, which is about maybe identity, which is also about how do people feel about devolution. It is also about how do people feel about their place and what is coming or not to their place. I think it is also, whether I like it or not, about how do people feel about central government. So there are all sorts of kind of ways in which we might increase turnout. I don't think it's simply a matter of the more powers you load into a mayoral combined authority or into a mayor's job, the more you're going to see turnout increase. I don't think it's as direct a correlation as that at all, because frankly, local government is a hugely important part of our political infrastructure. And as you say, loads of people don't turn out for it, right? So actually it's about more than that. And some of that will just come from the repetition of seeing your mayor or more on the TV, in the paper, on your social media feed. That's all going to kind of play into that challenge. I think there's kind of all sorts of democratic deficits in this country, though, that we don't quite understand. But I'm trying to, as I go through this process, have one eye on what does it take to get more people to understand that this is an important role and voting for it is important.
I think that's a really interesting answer. Thank you. And by the way, it's good to see some questions coming in from the people who are watching this live. Do keep them coming, and I will make sure we have time to turn to
This is
them.
not more.
Some
This is
really
not more
interesting
people
questions.
who've heard me say something in the past, and now I'm going to throw it back in my face. I've entirely changed my position or something. So fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. They're easier than that.
I'm hoping there'll be nothing like that. The even though it would make for a
Yeah.
very good event, selfishly speaking, Oliver, if that were to happen. So we've only touched on this so far, but it's sort of really important. So I want to make sure we get to it before we get to those questions. It's not just about the relationship with Whitehall. It's to do with the nature of the whole system. Actually, this is something we spoke about last time as well. I think you basically said that one of your ambitions is to stop seeing devolution as a process of giving powers away. I'm paraphrasing, and to start seeing it as part of a much bigger project of rewiring the state. So I suppose there's two sides to that, because I think if someone was watching this, just sort of maybe just a normal non-nerdy person watching this, they might be tempted to say, well, what rewiring of the state? There's been a lot of activity. There's been quite a lot of noise about it going on in policy terms, but actually the big headline rewiring attempts, missions, they seem to have sort of fallen by the way. I think that's sort of pulled the rug out from under a lot of people's feet. Devolution, I think, is full steam ahead, but of course we've had a pretty major reshuffle that might have an impact on that. So the big kind of headlines of rewiring might not be exactly where we thought they would be, or they might not be progressing. So I wanted to check in with you about that. How is rewiring going? How does it look from where you are in South Yorkshire and from your relationships with central government? But then when it comes to devolution and its role in that, are the powers where they want to be? Are you making traction in the areas you want to be? You alluded at the beginning that there were lots of things you would want to change about your settlement. What would they be? So sorry, that was about 12 questions in one, wasn't it? Sorry.
Let me try and answer. So just directly in answer to you, kind of what more powers would I want? Not just me, but I think we all, as mayors, are looking at, for instance, things like visitor levy. So there's a fiscal devolution question in here, which I think we'd all like to address as mayors. Some of us are more ambitious than others, but certainly I think we would all be keen to start with things like a visitor levy. It seems to work elsewhere in the country. I think Manchester have essentially got a version of a visitor levy, albeit not one that's statutory. But I think that's a good example of where this can work. And I think mayors having more power in that sort of space is important. Also on things like education, for trying to create a certain type of economy in South Yorkshire as we are. I think we need more ability to influence education in order to create the people that we want to work in our economy in the next 20 or 30 years. Certainly when you look at the crisis of like AI that's looming for all too many young people, I think mayors being able to be in place helping young people to get through that is probably going to be increasingly important. And then also health. I've led in lots of ways on health devolution. First person to chair my ICP. Lots of work going on in South Yorkshire now because of the health inequalities that we face. But routinely I'm coming up against the challenge of not being able to have enough levers to be able to pull on to change the picture of health long term, and I'm determined to try and do that. So they'd be the three areas I would think come top of mind. When it comes to rewiring the state, what I'm talking about, I think, is this crisis of agency. I'm talking about the fact that all too many people feel locked out of the political system, and when you see this drift to reform, I don't for a moment actually think that drift to reform is down to the political solutions or otherwise that Nigel Farage is throwing out there. And Nigel Farage is frankly a fraud, and I don't think that he has the solutions to the communities like ours. I don't think he understands the problems, let alone knows how to fix them. But he's very good at standing in a pub with a pint and telling people that it's all the fault of immigrants, right? So like, I think actually what people are saying when they're trying to vote for an alternative is they're trying to say, we're not happy with what's going on in the world, and certainly in my bit of the world, right? Like all politics are local, right? So I think people are essentially trying to say we're frustrated and pissed off, and we want you to do it differently. And that requires, I think, a bravery from politicians to give more power away. It requires a bravery for politicians to say, I don't know the answer. It was a bravery from politicians to say, actually, hang on, I'm going to have a conversation with you before I take that decision. And that requires a different form of state to be able to allow that conversation to take place and be effective. We pioneered citizens' assemblies in South Yorkshire, biggest regional citizens' assembly in the country, looking at climate. really important to do that. I hold regular mayor's question times and engagement sessions. I'm on the radio every month taking questions from anybody and everybody. We're trying to develop, rather than a one-way communication system, a conversation with our communities. But that can't just be a conversation. It has to also then result in action. And that's how you overcome this gap when it comes to agency. And I think that is a really important and will, I think, define politics over the next 20 years. Because look, if reform do become the government in however many years' time, I personally am not sold on that idea. I don't think it's as inevitable as some people would claim, despite what you look at in the polls right now. I just think it is, there's a long way to go. I think there's lots of things that could happen, clearly. But let's, for argument's sake, that they do. I don't think they're going to solve the problems that people face any more than Donald Trump is solving the problems that people face when it comes to inequality or healthcare or transport or anything else, or climate in America. But frankly, people want something different because the system as it is constructed right now isn't working for all too many people. Can I just give you one example of that, which I always try and remember when I'm talking about this sort of stuff? There's a John Harris, the Guardian journalist, he does a series outside Westminster. And he went, I think it was in Wigan, and he went to Wigan, and this, we're talking sort of 5-6 years ago, whenever it was. I mean, it was the height of the kind of Brexit debates about kind of what sort of deal we were all going to get and all the rest of it. And he was talking to this bloke who, he was kind of late 50s, early 60s, coming up to retirement. And he'd previously been working for a supermarket chain doing logistics at quite a senior level, and then lost his job. And John met him in a food bank. And he said and he was helping out with the food bank just because he had skills to help, do that sort of work. And he said, what are you doing at the moment? He said, well, I'm trying to find work, but every time I go for a job, there's 30, 40, 50, 100 people who are going for that job who are younger than me and, got a load of skills that, computer, IT skills, whatever, that I simply don't have. I'm transitioning to universal credit. I've got £10 to the end of the month. And this was, bear in mind, this was the end of the middle of the Brexit sort of debates about what deal we would get. And John said to me, how did you vote last time on Brexit? He said, I voted to leave. And he said, given how it's gone since then and the mess that's been created, and certainly the turmoil that you've seen, and you finding life much harder than previously, how would you vote again? And he said, I'd vote to leave again. And he said, what, despite everything? He said, yeah. He said, why? He said, because I can't be worse off, can I? And I think there's an element of that, right, that's just like spreading throughout our communities. Like, I can't be worse off, can I? So actually, what's the response of the state to people like that guy and the millions of other people like him who are sitting at home right now saying, well, it can't get any worse. So you're telling me, yeah, right, you don't get freedom of movement when it comes to, Brexit, or you don't get this advanced high-tech manufacturing center in your community, or you don't get that solar farm or this wind turbine or whatever else. Like, you're telling me if I vote Reform, not Labour, that's what I don't get. Well, can't be any worse, can it? And this guy at least is promising to rip up the system and start again and go back maybe to some of the things that I used to get and that you used to know. And that was, when my life was a bit easier. This guy's telling me all those kind of, easy truths are the way that they'll go if I vote for him. Well, it can't get any worse for me and my family, so I might as well give that a go because I've tried everything else. So let's give that a pop. And I just think that's where we're headed if we aren't prepared to confront the hard reality of, like, we have to, as people who want to see progressive change in the Labour Party or any other party, take on that challenge of how do we change the system so it delivers for people who currently feel cut out, left behind, and hugely frustrated with the way it works for them and their families. And that's not a big P political point. That's what's the system that we need to create so that everybody can have their say in this country, whatever their views may be.
I really did intend to go to the questions after, but I have to pick up on what you said there. That's so interesting. So because the thing that always sticks with me about the kind of the aftermath of that Brexit debate is that there was the befuddlement or the confusion or the puzzlement, to put it mildly, of the Remain perspective in the aftermath of that. It was a clear-cut economic case. And then a few years later, look at the economy. It was a clear-cut economic case. And then a few years after that, look at the economy. It was a clear-cut. But the thing that never seems to cut through from that mentality is that that was a decision that lots of people took on anything other than the economy. Because, well, first of all, because they felt like things can't get much worse for me, as you sort of point out there, but also because there are 25 other dimensions of how you make a political decision that have nothing to do with your pocketbook and have everything to do with how you feel and where you see yourself and what you think might be right or just. And it was sort of a weird tone deafness. And so to bring this back to mayoral politics, presumably a successful mayor can't afford to be only about the economy, can't afford to be only tone deaf about that. But we've constructed a mayoral system that is first and foremost, and I think you led off with this, about the economy, about economic development.
Mm. Yeah, which is why I kind of try and bring in those other aspects of pride and prosperity and purpose, right? That it is not just about growth. And I think what we saw through the Brexit debates was people were prepared to exchange potential economic benefit for greater control over their future, right? I think that was essentially what we saw. Now, look, let's be clear. Yes, the Remain campaign, of which I was part, made the case that actually leaving the EU would be worse for people in places like mine, right? And right now, what we're seeing, for instance, as a result of Liberty Steel facing the challenges it has done, and now huge tariffs coming in from the EU, is, forgive my French, Farage just fucked South Yorkshire, right? Because he voted for it, he supported it, he wanted it, and now we're in the place we are. And working people, not wealthy people, are paying the price for that decision that was supported by this person who is now saying, oh, it's all the fault of elites in London. Well, quite honestly, I'm born and raised in South Yorkshire. I'm representing my community, and I'm saying it was a crap decision for us in our region because of what it's done to working people. But the question that I think was forefront of most people's minds at the time, to be fair to them, was like, whose growth? Like, you're telling me we're going to be worse off. Well, am I going to be worse off? Because it doesn't feel like I can be worse off at this point. In 2016, kind of following years of austerity and financial crash, can I be worse off than I am? So, again, like, I might as well vote for it because something will change at least, and it might work out in my favor. I'm going to give it a go. Right. So, no, absolutely. Like, we have mayors who are trying to grow their economies, but also trying to do something else, which is recognize that these decisions aren't always about rationality, just about what money is going in my pocket, because actually it's much more complicated and nuanced than that. I think behavioralists amongst us would call it a sort of rational act of fallacy, the idea that we believe that everybody is weighing up the costs and benefits, equally and in the same way to come out with the most rational benefit to the common good. It's not that clear cut, and it's not that straightforward. And some of this is just about gut feeling. And people like Nigel Farage have been much better previously at tapping into that gut feeling than some people on the left. I think that's where mayors can actually be more effective at pushing back and saying, actually, I understand my place, and you don't speak on behalf of South Yorkshire. I do.
That's such an interesting conversation. Look, let me, because I think there's some really interesting questions here, and I want to try and get through some of them at least. There's a few questions here that sort of touch on questions around scrutiny and accountability. So can we talk about that for just a moment? So one question here: do you think you're scrutinised enough? Do the current mechanisms need to be strengthened before additional powers can be devolved? Is that effectively a blocker for devolution? Another question here about what are the problems with sort of crossing the boundaries and working more with other mayors? Does this sort of reduce the opportunities for accountability and scrutiny? So thoughts in that sort of area?
Yeah, I don't think we are scrutinised enough, and I don't put the blame on the local councillors, for instance, who are involved in that process. We've got an overview and scrutiny committee, we've got all the right functions to be able to do that in the way that it is designed, but I don't think those people are given the support, the time, frankly, the money to be able to do that job properly. So I think there needs to be a different model potentially of what scrutiny could look like. I'd probably be interested in things like citizens juries and bringing in people into that system, supporting people to be able to kind of be much more engaged in that process. And I think we have to kind of think about that in a different way. I do what I can, though, to try and be as visible as accountable. I've said repeatedly, I want to be the most transparent and accountable mayor in the country, and I take that seriously. So that's why I go out and do Mayor's Question Time. It's why I go out and do my monthly phone in. It's why I am always trying to engage on social media, because actually I want people to feel like this is a conversation, not simply me pronouncing. But I do think there are different ways of doing that. I also think the question of local press and the vibrancy of local press and media is also part of that challenge. And yes, the local democracy reporters are important in that system, but we need to go further than that. I think the BBC have a responsibility in particular as the national broadcaster to be looking at things like, and I've said this to Tim Davie and others, there should be a devolution correspondent. There should be people who can actually look at the politics of devolution and scrutinise that effectively in a way that individual democracy reporters can't, because you can't always map it across the country. And you look at people like what happened in Tees Valley and the scrutiny that Ben's been under. It took the Yorkshire Post, it took local reporters to specifically go and kind of focus there. And actually, like, that is good for the whole system. If you've got more scrutiny, I think it's good for democracy, but we haven't seen enough of it. So keen to see both the informal, newspapers, social media, whatever it might be, to formally look at the scrutiny, but also the system that we have to be more effective too.
That's such an interesting answer because we've had the opposite answer from different mayors actually. So, but let's not pause on that for too long. You're talking about the sort of the overall health of the whole area. That the kind of the outside of the state are the kind of local news sources in a
Yeah.
position to do that job. A similar question here, I think, that connects with that question is, and it makes a claim that I can't verify live, but you may be in a better position to. What do you see as the factors behind here's the claim, the decline of community organisations in South Yorkshire? What can be done to address this? Can you verify that that's going on? What do you think is going on there?
I think it's an interesting statement, an interesting question, because I think we're seeing what it means to have community shift, aren't we? For instance, if I look at some of the online groups that have sprung up, what be Sheffield Community Forum on Facebook, for instance, a very live debate and conversation going on there every single day amongst 60,000 people who are connected through this forum, some more, some less, but who are having a very live conversation about what they want to see, what they know, what's happening in our communities. Right. Maybe we might have seen a decline in your local scout group or litter picking group. I couldn't verify that either. I suspect it's probably right, but that's where I think I need to play more of a role. We as the state need to play more of a role in providing the funding, the support, the encouragement to some of those groups to be in person and actually kind of live and encouraged to be meeting and dealing with problems in communities in real life. But I also think we've got to try and engage with and understand what this online space looks like and how that can also play a role that is positive and progressive for our communities too. And I don't claim to have the answer, but I certainly recognize it as a challenge, and recreating and re-establishing community as a really important part of what I want to try and do as mayor. Because as I say, I think communities in South Yorkshire, which once were incredibly strong as a cohesive group, look at what happened during Orgreave and the miners' strike and Women Against Steel, or Women Against coal, Women Against the cuts, all that sort of stuff. Pit closures, that's the phrase I was looking for. Those sorts of groups showed, I think, the strength of community and identity that we had. We've lost it, but I would like to try and, at least in some way, shape or form, online or otherwise, to get back to that sense of community.
That's really helpful, thank you. Here's a couple of really interestingly spiky questions that I think pick up on different things you've said over the course of this conversation. So interested to see what you do with them. So first of all, I think a really interesting question. You've said that it's more important that Luke Campbell represents Haycott and you represent South Yorkshire than the fact that he's in the Reform Party and you're in the Labour Party. So we're looking at the prospect of more people outside of mainstream parties anyway. So the question is, should mayoral elections sort of be non-party? Is that should we sort of try to drain the party politics officially out of this? Now, it's hard for you to answer as a Labour politician, but mayors do deviate from party lines. We've already spoken about that. There is more need to do that. Is this a sort of a design flaw we baked into the mayoral system that we're still sort of subscribing to mass party politics?
I think it's really hard to get away from the idea that parties are always going to play a role, just because of the campaigning aspect of running for election. Like when I try and run for election, just the physical nature of running for election requires me to gather a team of people around me who can help me in that process. The party system is what gives me that capacity. So, a bunch of Labour Party volunteers, a sort of print mechanism, a mechanism for press and media that rightly is not provided by the MCA is what I need in order to run for election and hopefully get re-elected. So it's hard to see, when I've seen independents run against me, the thing I'm always aware of is they just don't have that system around them to understand how to do door knocking, to understand how to record information, which allows you then to do GOTV, etc. So that party system is what gives you that. That said, though, I'm not whipped. Right. So, yes, I have to stay within the confines of the Labour Party, but, not surprisingly, that's okay with me. In terms of political thought, I'm always going to be challenging to the Labour Party where I think that's the right thing to do. but I'm not whipped, so I don't have to agree with the government if I don't want to. I don't have to pretend to support, a measure that the government has advanced if I don't think it's right for South Yorkshire. So to a certain extent, I think we are seeing a much looser system when it comes to party politics in the mayoral races. I think it's going to be quite hard to imagine a future in which mayors are just de facto independents, just because I don't know how you would then run for election on a purely practical basis.
I think people do overlook parties are a response to a problem, which is how do
Yeah,
you resource that kind of
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
kind of thing. So you spoke about how, well, these lines that we draw around our jurisdictions, they're sort of arbitrary, they're accidents of history. Here's a question: would you support at some point going through a process redrawing strategic authority boundaries to align more with identity or with the economic reality? Would you at some point be open to reshaping what South Yorkshire looks like, or even being mayor of something other than South Yorkshire?
Is this where I make a pitch to take over West Yorkshire? Is this don't tell
I'm not
Tracy?
sure. I'm not sure everyone would approve of that.
Well, we already went through that in South Yorkshire. So we were Sheffield City region, and then which
True.
was nine local authorities, and then when came down to the four, because that was what worked on a political basis rather than on a economic basis. So I think we've already been through that process, and we seem to have found the right sort of form for devolution in our part of the world. I think that works pretty well. 1.4 million people is a pretty substantial place, but equally a pretty useful size to be able to trial, test, learn, do things on a fairly nimble basis. So I always talk about deepening devolution rather than widening devolution. I'm much more interested in deepening the devolution settlement that we have in South Yorkshire, as I say, to include things like education, health, fiscal devolution, rather than trying to extend the boundaries out and get more people into that. I think getting more powers into the system that we have is probably the sensible answer for us. I couldn't speak for others.
Right. Now, I want to end on my traditional final question. So we got some great value out of those contributed questions. Thank you so much for everyone who's watching doing that. But I'd like to end with this one. And sometimes this is much more of a salient question than others. Maybe it's less so on this occasion. But if you were in a conversation with someone who was about to become directly elected regional mayor, a combined authority mayor, what would your most important piece of advice be to that person based on what you've experienced?
Get some sleep. That's always that's a good one. Um, I mean, enjoy it, frankly, because it's a brilliant opportunity and a huge privilege. Never forget who you're there to represent. Is obviously important, but they are more, I think, political or just human pieces of advice more than anything else. What would my advice be? I think the thing that I have been sort of increasingly aware of over my 3 years as mayor is how important the organisation is. So the MCA itself, and so spending as much time as I can getting that right. So I would say to anybody, and certainly said to other mayors that have come into post, like really prioritise bringing in great people, growing the organisation on a sustainable footprint. Getting as much capacity as you can, because the more capacity you have, the more you're able to achieve on behalf of your communities, and that couldn't be more important. I think that's really important. And we've done that, or are in the process of doing that in South Yorkshire. I'm really proud of the team that we have in South Yorkshire now. I think be really clear about what it is that you are trying to achieve. You can't do everything, so you have to focus, and that's always the case in politics, but certainly for mayors, that is the case. I think that's really, really key. And going back to one of the answers I gave earlier, I think, try and set aside any electoral kind of questions you might have about your own future and focus on what it is that you are there to do. If in 20 years' time I can look back on the things I've kicked off in South Yorkshire, the things we're doing right now, be it beds for babies, bus franchising, the work we're doing to grow the economy, and I can sort of sit on a chair and stare out across my veranda, as it were, in South Yorkshire, and look at the success that we've made, that will be good enough for me. That is the pride I will take from it, regardless of what might happen to me electorally or in terms of my career. And I hope mayors take a slightly different view of that, because we're not in the hothouse that is Westminster competing with 650 other people who are all trying to kind of climb up a greasy pole. We're actually trying to do something for our place, and I think if you can just remember that at all times, then it will do you no harm.
Thank you so much. That's a great mental image to end on as well, with you on your porch, maybe
A
on a
greasy
rocking
pole
chair.
or a veranda. It was a mixed
Yeah,
metaphor.
yeah. Which of
Go
those do
with
you
it.
want? I think I'd rather be smoking my pipe on your porch in the
Sounds
rocking
good.
chair.
Sounds good.
We're so grateful for the time you've made to do this today. Thank you so much, Oliver Coppard, for joining us. For those watching live, this will be made available very soon, both as a YouTube video to stream, but also as a podcast. So watch out for that. And like I said, we've got more events coming up soon. So get in touch with us or check out our website, restate.co.uk, to see when those are coming up soon. And thank you all for tuning in, and see you soon for the next episode, for the next in our series of meetings with
And
mayors.
thanks to you, Simon, for such great questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Take care. Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.